Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. I wanted to do an update video from my last one that was about how to edit the MLVs you get from the Magic Lantern on the EOS M. I've done a lot of practicing and just experimentation with it, and what I've found is that it's actually... The reason I was saying use the cinema DNGs is because my belief had been that it was the bottleneck for quality would be the codec. And so choosing even ProRes 422 HQ would probably lower the quality over an actual raw like DNG. But I've tested that, taking the same clip and exporting it as either Cinema DNG or as just ProRes 422 and then editing them in DaVinci to look as close as possible, and what I found is that they are about identical. So what I would actually recommend you guys to do is to use the MLV app to edit your footage. And so what I'm going to do now is show you what I would basically do with a clip that I want to use. So I'm just going to run through it really quick for you guys. So first off, I usually always hit chroma smooth because there's nothing to lose, and it does deal with some of the noise. Like if we zoom in on something like here, you might see with and without, there's a bit of noise that goes away without affecting detail. The next thing I will usually do is come all the way down here to profiles where we have Reinhardt and we have Rec 709. What I usually like to do is change it to the Alexa wide gamut because I like how that looks a lot more. The color space looks way more cinematic. Then I'll take a look up here at this waveform, which is by default a histogram, but if you hit W on the keyboard, it becomes a waveform. If we stretch this out, it becomes a lot bigger and more detailed, and you can see what's happening here is that somewhere in here, it's becoming clipped. And I played with this a bit before I started recording, and what I found is that the best way to deal with this, where it's clipping, is you have highlight reconstruction, similar to the raw tab in DaVinci. Well, if we turn that on, it didn't do anything. But if I come up to exposure and I lower it just a bit, you can begin to see it. There it is. It's come back right there. We now have that highlight back, and you can see it looks way more normal. It's not being clipped. Here it looks way over, but if we bring it down, bam. And this footage was purposely overexposed just a tad. But now we have this footage looks really dark now. It's obviously not usable. Well, if my main solution to this is dark strength, I'll come down here and lower this a bit to get it somewhere more where I would like it to be, somewhere in here. So now if we look at that waveform again, we're not clipping anymore, and we have a decent stretch of information. What I can also do is come in here and grab this and push the whites back up to get that longitude that you would want. Instead of having it cap somewhere around here, it's now back up closer to where white should be. Usually this will be as far as I'll go, and I'll leave it for the most part. I might do a little bit more, like maybe bring shadows down just a tad bit here or there, or do something like that. The next thing I might do after, or like the more involved things I might do, is to add some sharpening. So if we hit F to do this little bit of a zoom in, where we can then click and drag around or scroll to zoom in even more, we can see how sharpening affects the image. And it's actually really rather fantastic how much sharpening you can get out of this program. But I usually only take it up to between 30 and 40%, pretty much kind of feel it out. The masking doesn't usually seem to help all that much. Sometimes it can if there's like fine details that look a little too pixely, you can throw in some masking. Denoising I almost never do, because while it's here and it's free, it's rather poor. It doesn't really do a good job. The only way, which is not because of the program, I should say, the bottleneck is the camera, not the codec or the editor. The footage is just so noisy that there's not really a decent way to get rid of it without completely destroying the shadows. So if we up the luminance, for example, it pretty much has to completely blur the image. We can lower this range, but it's still going to affect the image. Between not having it at all and adding some, you can see that it's affecting the entire image and making it look very soft. Same thing with the chroma, but to a lesser degree. So it's there and you can use it, and if you're willing to fiddle with it, you can probably get a bit cleaner. You're never going to get a clean image from the EOS M in the shadows. It will never be perfectly clean unless you have like the paid version of DaVinci Resolve. The next more advanced thing I'll do is, if I feel like it, I might apply a LUT in MLV App instead of in DaVinci. I might add it here. That's not often. It's mainly if I don't want to have to spend too much time in DaVinci, I'll add it here, but usually I'll do it in DaVinci. This is one of my favorite LUTs, but here we go. We have this, where it gets kind of crazy. So then you kind of have to, if you're going to do that, then you have to kind of re-edit it, which you would have to do in DaVinci anyway. And the quickest way to re-edit it is to just grab your white point and bring it down looking at your histogram, and then bring your black point up to where you're happy. And then that kind of gets you in the basic back to like a normal looking image, but with your LUT. Yeah, and then if I'm using anamorphic, since I'm now going to be exporting to ProRes 422 instead of the Cinema DNGs, I have to make sure to stretch it by 2 here, so that that'll be done. Then if we go into settings, you can see that I've been exporting at ProRes 422, because whether you're ProRes 422 HQ or 4x4, it doesn't seem to make a difference at all to the quality. The bottleneck, again, is the camera, not the codec. So you could probably get away with even the LT or even proxy would probably look perfectly fine. And then you can export from there and take it into DaVinci. So let's go over and look at DaVinci and see what some of that stuff looks like. Okay, so one of the things you might be asking is, what if, say, I have a lot overblown in my highlights and I want to recover as much as I can and get the best looking image? Well, one thing you might think is, oh, well, what if I give it a logarithmic curve like Alexa log C? Well, I thought of that as well, and that's what I used to do when I first got the EOS M and started editing it with it. That was my first thing, was obviously logarithmic curve, skadoosh, the best dynamic range possible. Well, it turns out that's not true. So here I have 2 of the same clip, one that was Arri log C, and the other that was just a normal Rec 709, or the Reinhardt specifically. So here's the log C, and here is the normal, the Reinhardt. You can see the obvious difference that this is way lower contrast and this is way higher contrast. But I did a basic edit here, so this is applying a LUT, adjusting for the LUT, and then this is getting rid of the color in the shadows. And this one has a very similar setup. Adjust for the LUT, and then getting rid of the color in the shadows. So what I'm going to do is we're going to Option D to turn all of them back on and get this basic, really harsh cinematic look. And then we're going to do the same thing here. And you can see if we look at the waveform switching between these two, it's about identical. I couldn't get it perfect, but it's as close as I could get it. And visually, the footage looks just about identical. So if we say switch back to that, get rid of that, and we're going to zoom in 100%, and we're going to look, bam, right there in the center, say. You can see what this looks like versus like this. It is darn near identical. The dynamic range is about identical. So is it worth it to turn it to a logarithmic curve? Not really, pretty much. If you were shooting on a camera and you set it to log in the camera, yes, because then you're getting 12 stops of dynamic range. But again, in this case, the bottleneck is the camera, which only records, the EOS M is something in the ballpark of 11.5 dynamic stops, or stops of dynamic range. And so what I found is that if you export as this is just a normal ProRes 422 file as Reinhardt with some really basic edits, this is what it looks like. And I believe I changed the color gamut to the Alexa. I want to say I did that. I might not have. This is what it looks like, and you can easily grade it, and it looks about identical to if I had done it in a logarithmic curve. Down here we can see this test where all I did was another option that you have. Because you might think of, well, what if I just want to do a basic look? One of your options you can do is say, we're going to take this clip, we're going to say select a preset, and we're going to select the Arri log C, which was already set to. What it'll do is change your tone map to Arri log C, your gamma to their RGB, and your gamma to 1.0. And what that'll do is if we go back here, we'll find that clip, which is this one. And here, all I've done, we'll create a new node. So here's the export of it, which is clean. It looks like Arri log C. And then let's say we want to slap a LUT onto it to bring it back to normal, and skadoosh. We have it looking about as normal as it did when we shot it. So if we go back to, say, not sRGB, but Rec 709, versus this, it looks very similar. The only difference is that this is kind of clipping, but we can kind of deal with that a little bit and recover that and do some edits if you wanted to. But pretty much there's not much of a point to exporting in a log curve from MLV App. It doesn't do much for you. I hope that this has helped you guys. This is kind of an addendum to my last video, because it is unnecessary, plain unnecessary, to use the cinema DNGs because of their massive size. They're gigantic. Completely unnecessary. The ProRes files are ridiculously smaller. Because if we say, look at this file from a random video that I believe was only about a minute long, it's 1.24 gigs versus, let's grab this guy by random, that's 10 seconds, not a good thing, 9 seconds, 15, 12 seconds, like 300 megabytes, much smaller. I don't think it was a minute long. I believe this one was maybe 15, 20 seconds long. Let me check that quick. If we go back here, go up to here, go to here, go to here, we have 23 seconds. It was 23 seconds long. So you can see that that's a huge amount of space saved. 23 seconds. This one's 5 seconds, but that you save a huge amount of space by exporting at ProRes 422 over trying to save them as cinema DNGs. If it's an archival issue that you have, I would recommend saving the .mlvs, because then at least you have these options to pull from the MLV file, as opposed to saving the cinema DNGs, which are far more limited than this. I would recommend that if it's an archival thing. If you're, say, shooting a documentary or a short film and you want to archive every shot that you take, I would save the .mlvs and export as 422s and use those to edit with. That would be what I would do now, and that's what I have been doing for the past couple of weeks. So I give the guys that made MLV App props for it being actually a pretty decent editor overall. And I would say that this is definitely a pretty decent way to edit your footage. Not necessarily the best grader. I would still use DaVinci to actually grade the image, but this is definitely a pretty good editor and exporter. And again, the bottleneck is not the codec, not the editor. The bottleneck to your video quality if you're shooting with the EOS M is the camera itself, its own limitations. So keep that in mind when you're exporting. If you have like huge cinema DNG files, they're completely unnecessary is what I've found. And I would highly recommend doing your own practicing. Like record a clip that kind of pushes it a little bit and like the highlights maybe, and just play an MLV app and try and do different kinds of edits, because especially with these dark strength and range and light strength and range, they're very interesting ways to edit that you definitely should get used to, especially if you're going to be shooting with the EOS M for very long. Get used to how to edit with these, in like doing a basic edit before going to DaVinci and grading. But I hope this has helped you guys, and I hope you guys have a fantastic day. That is all.